was sitting across from a stranger in a crowded cafe, forcing a smile I didn't feel when I saw her Emma, my neighbor of 3 years, walking toward my table with grocery bags in her arms and a look of complete surprise frozen on her face. And in that single, humiliating moment, everything I'd been hiding from myself came crashing down around me, because the woman I'd been too afraid to talk to for years had just caught me pretending to be interested in someone I'd never see again. The blind date had been my sister's idea. She'd called me 2 weeks earlier, her voice full of that bossy concern. Older siblings specialize in saying, "David, you're 34 years old, you live alone. You barely leave your apartment except for work, and the only person you ever mention is your neighbor Emma, who you've never even had a real conversation with. You need to put yourself out there, so I'm setting you up with my friend Claire from yoga class. And don't you dare cancel." So here I was, sitting with Claire, a perfectly nice woman with kind eyes and an easy laugh, talking about her job in marketing and her love of hiking, and all I could think about was how she wasn't Emma, how her laugh didn't make my chest tighten the way Emma's did when I heard it through our shared apartment wall, how her smile didn't light up a room the way Emma's did every Saturday morning when she watered the flowers on her balcony while humming old jazz songs. Claire was mid-sentence, telling me about a camping trip in Colorado, when I saw Emma freeze near the cafe entrance, her eyes locking with mine. And the shock on her face was so raw, so unguarded, that I felt it like a punch to my stomach. But what came next was worse, because she didn't look away or pretend she hadn't seen me. Instead, she walked right up to our table, set her grocery bags down on the floor, and said in a voice that trembled just slightly, "David, hi, I didn't know you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." And Claire, sweet, oblivious Claire, smiled warmly and said, "Oh, no worries at all. Are you a friend of David's?" And Emma's eyes met mine again, searching, confused, maybe even hurt. And she said quietly, "We're neighbors." And then, as if the words had been building up inside her for years and could no longer be contained, she added, "Actually, can I talk to you for just a minute, David? It's important." My heart was hammering so hard I was sure both women could hear it, and I mumbled an apology to Claire, who looked understandably bewildered, and followed Emma outside into the cool evening air, where the streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, and the noise of the city felt distant and muffled. We stood there on the sidewalk, and Emma wrapped her arms around herself, even though it wasn't cold, her dark hair falling across her face as she looked down at her shoes, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence heavy with 3 years of missed opportunities and unspoken words. Finally, she looked up at me, her brown eyes glistening with something that might have been tears, or might have been just the reflection of the streetlights, and she said, "Why didn't you ask me out instead?" The question hit me like a wave, and I opened my mouth but no sound came out, because how could I explain that I'd been terrified, that every morning for 3 years I'd timed my departure for work just to catch a glimpse of her in the hallway, that I'd learned her schedule, her favorite coffee shop, the name of her cat, all from stolen glances and overheard phone conversations through thin walls, that I'd convinced myself someone like her, smart, beautiful, confident, always surrounded by friends, would never be interested in someone like me, a quiet software developer who spent his evenings reading and watching old movies alone. I started, then stopped, then tried again. "I didn't think you'd say yes." And the admission felt like pulling out a splinter that had been buried for years, painful but necessary. Emma's expression shifted from hurt to something softer, sadder, and she let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was no humor in it. "You didn't think I'd say yes," she repeated, and then she shook her head slowly, her voice breaking just a little as she continued, "David, do you have any idea how many times I've stood in my doorway pretending to check my mail, just hoping you'd come out and talk to me? How many times I've started to knock on your door to ask to borrow sugar or a cup of flour or any ridiculous excuse I could think of, but lost my nerve at the last second. I thought you weren't interested. So polite, but unavailable, like you couldn't wait to get away from me whenever we ran into each other in the hall. I stared at her, my mind reeling, trying to reconcile her words with the reality I'd constructed in my head, and I realized with a sinking feeling how completely I'd misread everything, how my fear had created a wall that she'd interpreted as disinterest, how we'd been living parallel lives of loneliness, separated by nothing more than our own assumptions and insecurities. I'm an idiot, I said, and this time Emma did laugh. A genuine one that made her whole face brighten despite the tears that were now definitely forming in her eyes. We both are, she said softly, and then her expression grew serious again, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. But you're in there on a date with someone else, so I guess I'm too late, and I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. This was stupid. I should let you get back to— No, I interrupted, the word coming out more forcefully than I'd intended, and I reached out and gently caught her hand before she could turn away, feeling the warmth of her skin against mine. The realness of this moment that I'd dreamed about in 1,000 different ways but never believed would actually happen. No, you're not too late, Emma. That woman in there, Claire, she's lovely, but I barely know her, and I only agreed to the date because my sister wouldn't stop nagging me, and because I was trying to stop thinking about you, trying to convince myself to move on from something I never even tried to pursue. Emma's fingers curled around mine, tentative but hopeful, and she asked, "What are we doing, David? Why have we wasted 3 years?" I thought about all the evenings I'd sat alone in my apartment, hearing her laughter through the wall and wishing I was brave enough to be the one making her laugh. All the times I'd rehearsed conversations in my head that I never had the courage to start. All the moments of connection we'd lost because we were both too afraid to risk rejection. I think, I said slowly, we've both been living in fear of not being enough, of being hurt, of taking a chance and having it blow up in our faces. I know I have. After my ex left 4 years ago, telling me I was too boring, too predictable, too safe, I just shut down. I stopped believing anyone could actually want me for who I am. So I stopped trying, stopped putting myself out there except for tonight. And even this was just going through the motions. Emma squeezed my hand tighter, her eyes full of understanding and something deeper, something that looked like recognition. My last relationship ended 3.5 years ago, she said quietly, right before I moved into the building. He told me I was too intense, too emotional, too much work, and I internalized that, made myself believe I needed to be different, less vulnerable, more guarded. But that just made me lonely, David. So lonely. And then you moved in across the hall, and you were kind and quiet, and you had this gentle way about you. And I found myself wanting to know you, to talk to you, but I was so scared of being too much again, of scaring you away, that I just waited, hoping you'd make the first move. And when you didn't, I assumed it meant you could see it too, that I was too much. I felt something crack open inside my chest, a wall I'd built brick by careful brick over years of self-protection, and I realized we'd been trapped in the same prison, just different cells. Both of us convinced we weren't worthy of connection, both of us starving for it. "You're not too much," I said, and my voice was rough with emotion I'd kept locked away for too long. "Emma, from where I'm standing, you're everything. You're light and energy and warmth, and I've spent 3 years watching you live your life with this beautiful openness and wishing I knew how to be part of it." Tears were sliding down her cheeks now, catching the glow from the streetlights, and she said, "You think I'm open? David, I'm terrified. All the time. I fill my life with noise, friends, activities, constant plans because I'm scared of being still, scared of being alone with myself and realizing I'm not enough. But when I'm in my apartment at night and everything's quiet, I hear you through the wall, and somehow that makes me feel less alone. Just knowing you're there. And I've wanted so badly to knock on your door and just be still with someone who might understand. Right there on that busy sidewalk with strangers rushing past us and the sounds of the city swirling around us. Something fundamental shifted between us, like we'd both been carrying pieces of the same map and finally put them together to see the whole picture. I need to go back inside, I said, and I felt Emma's hand start to slip from mine. Saw the light in her eyes begin to dim, so I quickly added, I need to apologize to Claire and end this date properly, because she deserves honesty and respect. And then I need to come back out here and ask you something I should have asked 3 years ago. Emma's breath caught, hope blooming across her face like sunrise, and she nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. I went back inside, my legs feeling shaky, but my mind clearer than it had been in years. And I sat down across from Claire, who looked up from her phone, with a knowing expression that surprised me. She's the one, isn't she? Claire said before I could speak, and there was no anger in her voice. Just a gentle understanding that made me like her even more, even as I was about to walk away. The neighbor you never talked to. I could see it in your face the moment she walked up. You looked at her the way everyone wants to be looked at. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and gratitude for her grace. I'm so sorry, Claire. You deserve someone who looks at you that way, and I'm clearly not him. This was unfair to you. She smiled and reached across to pat my hand in a gesture that felt almost maternal, despite us being roughly the same age. David, I agreed to this date as a favor to your sister, but also because I've been where you are stuck, afraid, going through the motions, and honestly, I could tell within the first 5 minutes that your heart wasn't in it. I'm glad your neighbor showed up and gave you both a push, because life's too short to spend it afraid. Now go get her, before she thinks you've changed your mind. I thanked her profusely, offered to pay for her meal and her taxi home, and she accepted with good humor, waving me away with an encouraging smile. When I burst back out onto the sidewalk, my heart seized for a moment, because Emma wasn't where I'd left her, and panic flooded through me. Had she left? Had I taken too long? Had she changed her mind? But then I spotted her sitting on a bench a few feet away, her grocery bags beside her, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes closed like she was praying or wishing, or maybe just trying to calm her nerves. I walked over slowly, and when my shadow fell across her, she opened her eyes and looked up at me with such raw hope and fear mixed together that I felt it in my bones. I sat down beside her, close enough that our shoulders touched, and I took a deep breath. Emma, I said, and my voice came out softer than I'd intended, but somehow that felt right. I've wasted 3 years being afraid of rejection, afraid of not being good enough, afraid of wanting something and losing it. But seeing you tonight, talking to you, finally being honest, I realize I've been losing something every day by not trying, so I don't want to waste any more time. Would you have dinner with me? Not tonight, because this is already the strangest night ever, and we both probably need to process it. But tomorrow, or this weekend, or whenever you're free, a real dinner, where we actually talk and get to know each other the way I should have tried to do 3 years ago. Emma's smile was like watching flowers bloom and fast forward, spreading across her face until it reached her eyes and made them shine with joy and relief. Yes, she said, and then she laughed. That same laugh I'd been hearing through the wall for years, but never thought would be directed at me. Yes, David, I would love that. I've been waiting for you to ask me for so long that I'd almost given up hope. And now here we are, sitting on a bench outside the cafe, where you were just on a date with someone else. And it's messy, and weird, and absolutely perfect. We sat there talking for another hour. The groceries forgotten, her ice cream probably melting. Neither of us caring, because we were finally doing what we should have done years ago, sharing our stories, our fears, our dreams, our favorite movies and books and songs, all the small details that build the foundation of knowing someone. I learned that she worked as a children's librarian and loved it because she got to share stories that changed lives. That her cat was named Fitzgerald after the author. That she'd been taking a pottery class for 6 months but was terrible at it and found that freeing. That she hummed jazz because her grandfather had been a musician and she'd grown up surrounded by his records. She learned that I'd wanted to be a writer but had taken the practical path into software development. That I still wrote late at night sometimes, just for myself. That I volunteered at a tech literacy program for seniors every other weekend. That the old movies I watched alone were mostly film noir and classic westerns. That I'd been too afraid to live loudly, but desperately wanted to learn how. When we finally stood to leave, the night had grown properly dark, and the cafe was closing behind us, the staff giving us pointed looks through the window. Emma picked up her grocery bags, and I insisted on helping her carry them, and we walked the 6 blocks back to our apartment building side by side, our hands brushing occasionally, each touch sending electricity up my arm. At her door, we stood in the hallway we'd passed through countless times without really seeing each other, and the moment felt heavy with possibility and new beginnings. "Thank you," Emma said softly, "for being honest tonight. For being brave enough to choose something real over something safe." I shook my head, smiling. "You were the brave one. You came up to me. You asked the question I was too scared to ask. You changed everything." She reached out and touched my face, just a brief brush of her fingers against my cheek, but it felt like a promise. "Then let's both keep being brave," she said. "Let's not waste any more time on fear." That weekend, we had our first official dinner, and it was everything I'd imagined, and better awkward moments, and comfortable silences. Deep conversations and silly laughter. The feeling of something clicking into place that had been slightly off-kilter for years. In the weeks that followed, our lives began to interweave, naturally, like they'd been waiting for permission to merge. Shared meals and movie nights. Long walks, where we talked about everything and nothing. Quiet mornings with coffee on her balcony, while she hummed jazz and I read her excerpts from stories I was writing, slowly giving voice to the creativity I'd buried. We discovered that we'd been living parallel lives of loneliness, both convinced we weren't enough, both hiding our true selves because we'd been hurt and had learned the wrong lessons from that pain. But more importantly, we discovered that we were both ready to unlearn those lessons, to be vulnerable again, to choose connection over self. Emma helped me see that being quiet and thoughtful wasn't the same as being boring. It was just who I was, and the right person would value that. I helped her understand that her intensity and emotional depth weren't too much. They were gifts that made her incredible at her job, a loyal friend, and someone who experienced life in full color. My sister called a month after that fateful blind date, asking how things had gone with Claire. And when I told her the whole story, the cafe Emma, the conversation that changed everything, she was silent for a long moment before bursting into laughter. "David," she said, still giggling, "I've been telling you to talk to your neighbor for 2 years. I set you up with Claire because I thought it might make you realize what you actually wanted. I guess it worked, just not the way I planned." 6 months later, Emma and I were no longer just neighbors who'd finally found the courage to connect. We were partners who'd learned that the biggest obstacles to love and connection are often the walls we build inside ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves about not being worthy or enough, the fear that keeps us isolated when what we really need is to reach out. Standing in her apartment now, since we've decided that maintaining 2 separate spaces, separated by a thin wall, made no sense when we wanted to be together. I thought about that night outside the cafe, about the question that had changed everything. Why didn't you ask me out instead? The answer I'd finally understood wasn't about Emma at all, it was about me, about my fear, about the belief that I wasn't worthy of what I wanted most. And the real transformation wasn't about finding love. It was about finding the courage to believe I deserved it, to take the risk of being seen and known and possibly rejected. because the alternative safety in loneliness was the slowest kind of heartbreak. As Emma came up beside me, slipping her hand into mine with the easy familiarity of someone who'd chosen to stay, who'd chosen me every day since that night, I realized that sometimes the person you're looking for has been right there all along, waiting for you to be brave enough to see them, and more importantly, to let yourself be seen.